We are so pleased and honored to have our speaker join us today, Dr. John Constantino. We actually were able to shoehorn him in here because we have a link with him. I'll explain that in a minute. Dr. Constantino is the Blanche Idelson Professor of Psychiatry and the Director of William Greenleaf Eliot Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Washington University in St. Louis. After receiving his undergraduate degree at Cornell, he went to Washington University School of Medicine for his medical degree, and then after that went for a further training, his residency in pediatrics and general psychiatry and child psychiatry at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York City, in the Bronx. Dr. Constantino has pioneered the development of quantitative methods for measuring and understanding development of reciprocal social behavior in children. He and his colleagues around the world have applied these methods to studies of the genetic and neurobiologic causes of autism. This is fundamental. The development of other disorders of social behavior in children and the effects of intervention. Dr. Constantino's work has involved the genetic epidemiology of autism, of autistic social impairment, qualitative and quantitative methods for measuring inherited phenotypic components of autistic syndromes, and the discovery of distinct patterns of familial aggregation of subclinical autistic traits in the relatives of children with autism. Well, that's a mouthful, right? What it means, folks, is that Dr. John Constantino cares intensely about where autism is coming from, and he is dedicated to identifying that, working with families and affected young people. He is project director, principal investigator of a number of studies, including studies that are multi-site and around the nation. He's part of a network of multi-site investigations that spans from coast to coast, from Atlanta to Washington State, and of course in St. Louis. I could read more about him. I would invite you to seek out his background. He is not just an eminent clinical researcher, that is, clinician and researcher, but a wonderful guy, Dr. John Constantino.
So, Gene, thank you very much for that very nice introduction, and I want to thank the organizers, the folks who made this beautiful venue possible, and certainly I had a wonderful evening last night meeting with Sandra and Gene and talking about the system, your mental health system here, which is impressive to say the least. I've been able to have other opportunities to interact with people and with the programs that are run within this system here, and we really look to that as a great model of not only the commitment to the population that you're serving, but strategies for delivering effective care. And I, of course, I'll say a little bit, of course, more about this. I also want to thank my collaborators here, Gene Herbison and Deb Willis, who worked together with us on a project that I'll discuss. So what I'm going to do is, over the next better part of an hour, I'm going to talk about what I think we know about the causes of autism and what we're learning and how we're not only going to get even a better understanding of that, but how I think that may translate into better interventions. Now, I have a couple of disclaimers. The first one is that I think in the program, somehow one of the words of the title got dropped out of my talk. So the title is not towards higher impact intervention, but towards a biology of higher impact intervention. And if that bums somebody out, if you guys don't want to hear about that, I'll understand if that we kind of bait and switch you to come, and if you don't want to hear about that, although I think they're very similar. And I promise I will talk about intervention, and I'll end my talk today with an evidence-based intervention story that I think is very important to keep in perspective. The other disclaimer is I can't even see my slides from here. I can imagine what it's like back there. I was tardy enough and delinquent enough not to get the slides into your packets, so you have no way of reading the slides. So I'll make a deal with you. What I'm going to do is I'm hoping this is even going to be better. That I'm going to use the slides to cue what I want to say, but I'm going to just try to talk. And I certainly will make the slides available to on the web for this wonderful resource that you have, that you'll be able to access them online. But I think this will actually work out better just to talk about kind of what's going on. Okay, so I'll advance this. The first thing I want to just disclose is any conflicts of interest, and I don't have any stock equity. I do some consulting for companies that are trying to develop new screening methods and new treatments for autism. My sources of research support are listed there from the federal government and from some non-federal sources. And I also wanted to disclose that I get royalties on an instrument that we developed years ago to study autism in a different way. When I finished my training in New York, autism was an all or nothing thing. And the way I learned about autism was one of the senior professors who is still around and who I dearly love would stand and watch a clinical observation of a child and kind of, cock her head this way and cock her head that way, and at the end of the session, she would let you know whether that child had autism or not. That the decision was made. This is either autism or it isn't. And when I started my research career related to autism, I thought maybe there's a different way to look at that. So we developed a quantitative way of measuring autistic symptoms and traits, and it's what really launched my career in this field, to think about autism in a different way, not as an all or nothing thing, but as something that happens in all degrees and shades of gray. And the repercussions of studying it that way and just looking at that way, really, essentially, you'll be able to tell here, have really driven my entire career. And it was just a very simple, different way of looking at things. So, and I had a lot of help along the way, and I'll point that out as well. But anyway, the measure got published. It's a 15-minute kind of checklist measure that's used now that teachers and parents can fill out to rate the severity of a child symptoms who have autism spectrum kind of symptoms. And the reason that we turned it over to a publisher was to get it translated. And so it's been translated into about 30 foreign languages, and now it can be used in other places. It's very cheap and easy to use, but I do disclose that we receive royalties from the sales of that scale. All right, so what I'm going to do is go take a rapid run through what I think the big ticket items are in science right now that will inform interventions. And the first thing I want to get out of the way right at the beginning is the question that I get at every single autism talk that I have ever given and will ever give, which is, what's up with the autism epidemic? Okay? And this is what I think is up with the autism epidemic. So this is a slide from a study that was published last year in Archives of General Psychiatry. And it was a national survey of adults in the United Kingdom. And it was a very elegant, simple, beautiful design. And it simply took this approach. If the prevalence of autism, if the incidence of autism has risen astronomically from a prevalence of 1 in 10,000, when I was going through training, to 1 in 100 now. And since it's a condition that starts in infancy and early childhood, then it stands to reason that if we look at all the adults in the population and measure all the adults in exactly the same way, then there should be way more autism in the 20-year-olds than in the 30-year-olds, than in the 40-year-olds, all the way out to the 90-year-olds, okay? Because that's what happens if there's an epidemic. Well, that line on that slide, on the horizontal axis is different ages, the different birth cohorts that they studied, from people in their late teens all the way to their 90s. And on the vertical axis is the prevalence in that group, when everybody's definition is used the same. Now, you don't know what the units are because you can't see them that far, but that entire line from the 20s all the way to the 90s is falling between 0.5% and 1.5%. So I think that there really is no autism epidemic, that these conditions have been around a long time, and finally now, as we're diagnosing the condition now and catching about 1% of the population, we're starting to get it right about understanding who is affected by this condition and who we should be helping. The kind of social development that is impaired in autism, which is, as I think everybody in this room knows, it's the fundamental capacity for turn-taking, back and forth social engagement, eye contact, being on the same wavelength. This is a fundamental human capacity, just like, for example, intelligence. And for those children who are at the severe end of the bell curve for intellectual functioning, let's say 2.5%, we say that those children have an intellectual disability when they're at the far end. We need to help them, and that is the right thing to do. That is the appropriate, civilized thing to do. So for social behavior and social ability, why would we want it to be any less than that? Why would we not provide support to children who are at the 1%, or let's say the 2.5 percentile extreme for difficulty with the fundamental capacity to engage in a human social relationship? So, again, I think that much of the epidemic of autism has to do with a recognition, and the way that we diagnose it now is capturing an appropriate swath of the population. Many children who were deemed to simply have intellectual disabilities, as you know, now are understood to have autism, and so that kind of diagnostic substitution also makes up for some of that change. But I think this study from just last year is the best evidence that we have, the best of everything that's been done, that addresses this issue of, is there an autism epidemic? And that's just my take on it. We can talk more about that at some point. Now, I mentioned this thing called the bell curve, and I'll just use this slide. The one thing that you can see is the shapes of the curves on these slides. What this slide represents is 3 different studies in 3 different populations in the many thousands of children, using 3 different measurement methods for autistic traits and symptoms. And all 3 of these are general population samples. This is not studying kids with autism. This is studying every kid in the population. And if you look on those slides, on the horizontal is severity. So for each of the panels on the right is more severe affectation. And on the vertical axis is how many kids meet that level, what proportion of the population. And what you see in every case here is a smooth, continuous distribution. When you look at the right-hand side of those curves, you tell me where we should put the cutoff between who's affected and who's not affected. Because there's different gradations at every place along the way. There's no dip or no valley where you've got a separate group of affected kids and a separate group of unaffected kids. It's, as best depicted in the curve on the left, it's a bell curve. Just like intelligence, just like height and weight and blood pressure.